Welcome to Talk 2 of Gentleness and Political Legitimacy, the Shambhala teachings on warrior kingship from a Western perspective. In this talk, this short video, I'm going to be talking about the Shambhala critique of the Western tradition and also the deep defense of that tradition that comes from constitutional theory and history. So I hope you've already watched Talk 1. And if you haven't, this will make even less sense to you. So I encourage you to go back and see that. If you have, let's begin with a question. So I'd like to ask you to contemplate whether conflict among different groups in society is inevitable. And is it productive? So if you need more time, go ahead and pause the video. Otherwise, move along with me. The first thing I want to present is the enlightened dualistic view, or the as good as it gets view. In this view, the conflict between the ruler and the warrior is inevitable, as we've seen in the first slide, but is also desirable. It's desirable for three reasons. Because stability breeds corruption, and the disruption of stability interrupts the accretion of power to subordinate parts of the government and to powerful individuals. Competition produces excellence. So if people are competing against each other, they're trying to get better, and excellence is a value. And so we want competition because we want to have the best people doing the best things. And that in general promotes prosperity and progress throughout society. So the enlightened dualistic view is pessimistic about the possibility of stability in society, in particular about the kind of stability or the kind of rulership that Shambhala proposes, which is the unification of the warrior and the king into a single person. So one thing that the Western tradition asserts or is based on is that the principals are not the principles, if that makes sense to you. That is to say, principles are going to be at war with each other. And that whether a person occupies a certain position in society now doesn't guarantee that they will continue to occupy that, but the position will still exist. And this results in the kind of competition and for positions and the kind of disruption that we were talking about. So not to embrace this conflict and this very fundamental instability in politics is to court disaster. So we'll say there are shifting principles, or shifting credentials rather. The heroic and the procedural credentials are the two types of ruling credentials that we can talk about in Western society. So I've represented the procedural, meaning having a legal claim to rule in the letter K, or the traditional epic term of king, and I've represented the warrior credential, or the credential of personal worth, being a basis for one's status or one's power in society, one's position, with the letter H for hero. Because again, I'm coming out of the epic tradition, and that's the way the conflict is most often represented. So when the king is also the greatest warrior, that may for a time fulfill a political ideal, but it cannot last long. And so here are some examples of why it can't last long. Let's just say that you are the great general and you become elected president. As soon as you are elected, you are now bound up in legal institutions, and you will quickly lose the credentials you had before you were president on the basis of your military performance, and you'll become identified with the political position. The positions are both still there, but one of them that you used to occupy is now vacant because you've moved over to the other. That's not to say there's nothing you can do in order to kind of keep up your credentials as a hero, but you might have to go invade another country or something like that. It's not a stable relationship. A second example is that a person who inherits the throne from a heroic ruler is not heroic. So now the throne, let's just say you had a warrior king. The warrior king's heir is not necessarily a warrior king, because what it takes to be a warrior is very different from what it takes to be a king. The warrior claim is based on personal worth or personal deeds or personal qualities. So the person who rules, sits on a throne or occupies a presidency, has a legal title. So immediately there's no reason to, it's very hard to see a person sitting for very long on both of these credentials together. So another way in which credentials shift, looking at it from the military point of view, a military leader who is submissive to the political hierarchy. So we're talking about someone in the number 2 position, if you look at the diagram up here, who is submissive, loses their heroic or warrior credentials and invites a challenge from another military person. A political leader who relies too much on the support of the military alienates and weakens the legal institutions, the government institutions that they rely on for their legitimacy and exercise of power. So if I'm not a very strong military leader and I try to shore up my credentials by saying the military loves me, that alienates me from the government itself and overall weakens my claim to rulership. So there are just many ways, an infinite number of ways in which this arrangement of the unity of heroic and warrior credentials, even the marriage of the two of them, is unlikely to last. And having a hero king is not a solution to the problem. So nevertheless, as hard-nosed as this tradition is, the defense of or enlightened dualism, it's based on some false premises, and that means that maybe it hasn't formulated the problem correctly. So some of these false premises are, when one person is ruling, others are of necessity being ruled. So in the Shambhala teachings, that is not the case. When one person rules, only then can others rule. Second, the notion there's a hierarchy of personal worth. As I said, that's a fallacy. So there might be excellence, but that doesn't necessarily translate into one person being worth more than another. And the dualistic tradition sees relative worth. And that's why we can talk about the heroic claim, not just the warrior claim, but it's the claim to a certain kind of overall superiority that accrues in traditional societies to the greatest warrior. Another fallacy, that personal freedom and legal authority are mutually exclusive. And finally, there's a fourth fallacy, which is that labels are the only social reality. In other words, positions or what you're good at, and that these labels have, the notion is that these labels have some sort of reality to them, but only the label has a reality. So in other words, if you're a warrior, a great warrior, and you lose a great general, let's say, and you lose your label as a great general through whatever means, then you don't have a social existence at all. Whereas it may be that there's another type of social existence besides what you're called. So because there's this question about the premises of the Western tradition, and all of these questions are related to the dualistic nature of the Western tradition, we want to look and see if there's some alternative to that. So of course, as Shambhalians, we're like already there, but I'm trying here to pull us back from there and see with sort of fresh eyes why the Shambhala teachings really do have something very important to offer, not just to us as individuals, but to the societies in which we live. So non-dualism is, of course, the alternative, and it means that there's no choice or conflict between two principles. So I've restored the Shambhala diagram to the upper left for this slide, and that's based on the notion that there are two principles. There is an H and a K, there's a hero and a king, which in the Western tradition have warring or separate claims to power. But here, there's no choice necessary between them. They don't engender different political parties or points of view. They're simply different aspects. So there is a dualistic split, but there's not a dualistic response to that split. So we're not denying the separate articulation of things, of the 10,000 things, but we're denying that the implication of splits like that is that there must be conflict and there must be choice between them. They must be mutually exclusive, or that there must be a hierarchy. So the second Shambhala critique of Western society has to do with individualism, and you'll notice that you can't spell individualism without dualism. So individualism is the view that individuals are separate and they experience only their own point of view. It's like being in the front passenger seat of a car. I don't know about you, but I always feel like the car is out of control because I'm not driving. But there's someone driving who's actually in control. But that doesn't matter from the individualistic point of view. So I cannot have someone else's experience. And if someone else, just as in the previous critique, if someone else is ruling, I am being ruled. And I'm definitely not ruling. So there's a certain resentment of the ruler that's almost inevitable on the basis of individualism, because if I'm not ruling, then I cannot fully appreciate that ruling is taking place except by seeing it as someone else ruling me or someone else ruling more than I rule. So there are two ways, and the third one isn't really a way, so it shouldn't have the number 3 next to it, or I should redo this slide. But there are some ways, common ways of relieving the resentment of individualism, or the resentment of rulers from an individualistic point of view. One is, you could call it self-delusion, although maybe that's a little too cynical. And that is to believe that one actually has power over the ruler. So for example, one, because one can vote, one believes that one has the actual power. Or you're a very powerful person and you think that you actually, you're in charge and you tell the ruler, the president, whatever, what to do. The second is scapegoating. So this relieves the resentment because I join a faction, I submit to a ruler, but in submitting to that person, I believe that I'm given power. Maybe I'm actually given some sort of power over another faction. And I think that's my understanding of what it means to be a Trump supporter right now. What we're experiencing right now is quite predictable in the context of both the Western tradition and in the context of a correct understanding of the Shambhala critique of that tradition. And finally, you can withdraw. I think there's a certain element of self-delusion again in that, but because it's still based on individualism, and so you still haven't really solved the problem that someone else is ruling your world. But you could sort of not be involved in politics, or live off in the woods or something. So at this point, it may be appropriate to address this question. I think I've dropped some hints, but why should Shambhalians study the kind of stuff that I'm talking about? Why not just, especially if the dualistic tradition has all these problems with it, why even bother with it and just not go straight to basic goodness and gentleness? And especially if those are the solutions that I'm suggesting, anyways, just continue with our practices and radiate out a solution. We don't have to go through the weeds. So I want to offer a couple of thoughts on that. And I think these are really persuasive. And I think you'll recognize some of these. So one is, this is a way of actually refining our practice. So this is meditation in political action, which is very hard to do. But I think that by suggesting the power of gentleness, I'm providing a really practicable and pretty straightforward way of applying the Shambhala teachings and extending our practice. So we practice openness on the cushion, or maybe even in relationships or various situations. We try. But we also reserve the right to sort of, shut down to politics or wall off our practice from politics. And I think that's very common. It's not necessary, but necessarily the case. It's not inevitable, but it's very common. Now, political gentleness, which is non-defensiveness of position, is a bold extension of the practice of openness to the real world, to the world that we often exclude from our practice. And so if we can practice gentleness, if we can practice non-defensiveness in our lives, if we can notice our defensiveness and drop it over and over and over, it actually accelerates our progress on the path and removes a tremendous obstacle, which is the notion that there are areas we can't practice in. It's hard. Vulnerability is very hard. I'm speaking for myself there. So another reason why we should study this is, or think about this, at least to the extent of watching these 6 videos, is genuineness. So taking the Shambhala teachings seriously in a world dominated by the Euro-American tradition requires that we engage not just the superficial problems of our society, but the deepest levels of the Western tradition. And we seek out the deepest ideas that defend and support that, and we take those on. Also, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of basic goodness or non-aggression. So basic goodness is not powerless, and it's not refraining from using power or being powerful. It is allowing power to radiate, is the Shambhala word, of course. So this is a fundamental view for engaging in the Shambhala practices, and we can't refuse to engage with power. And if we want to engage with power, we should understand it. And again, we should understand it off the cushion. And finally, indestructible. There's sometimes a notion that basic goodness is nice. It manifests as nice. But we're not talking about nice here. We're talking about confident. Ultimately, we're talking about the indestructibility of that underlies the possibility of gentleness. So I want to just close this talk by looking at the Homage, which is a chant that we begin with every morning if you're not familiar with it. So I'll just flip through these slides for a second and show you that these are the last 3 slides of this video, and also that there are 3. So the chant, I'll read the chant in case you're listening and not watching this. He who has neither beginning nor end, who possesses the glory of tiger, lion, Garuda, dragon, who possesses the confidence beyond words, I pay homage at the feet of the rigged and king. And when going through this, I'm not going to talk about what the glory of tiger, lion, Garuda, dragon means. There are great resources for that, but the purpose of this talk is not to talk about the Shambhala teachings outside of the context of their engagement with the Western political tradition. So in the notes, I've put some comments about how we might see this chant in a way that maybe you haven't before, by using the sorts of concepts that I've already introduced in these 2 talks. So first of all, you'll notice that who possesses the glory, who possesses the confidence, and so on and so forth. These are descriptions of personal worth, but having neither beginning nor end, possessing the glory of tiger, lion, Garuda, dragon, possessing those are personal worth, but without a person. So again, there's that pointing towards non-dualism. It's a description of warrior attainment, but it's not a description of warrior deeds. It's not a description of anything that you as an individual could possess, or that might place you in a higher relationship to another person dualistically. So non-dual rulership, means that any warrior is a king, and to the extent that we have some warriorship, we rule. So the way Trungpa Rinpoche said in commenting on this, the way one identifies with the Rigdons is by actually becoming a warrior oneself. And the Rigdons are, for our purposes today, the political ideals of Shambhala. They are the political ideal of Shambhala. And so by identifying with the Rigdons through practice, we actually become a warrior oneself. So now we've gone the other way in, and that we become a warrior, and thereby we rule. So the second stanza is, they who possess great wisdom, brilliant and profound, who are ever just and benevolent to their subjects, who subjugate their enemies and are supremely powerful. By the golden yoke of their imperial rule, they ward off dens of plague, famine, and war. Gesar, Norbudradal, Ashoka, Maharaja, emperors of Japan, China, and so on, I pay homage to the ancestral sovereigns. So the ancestral sovereigns are sort of lineage ancestors of Shambhala. What this stanza is doing is talking about what, there's actually a word for this, or a phrase for this, performative legitimacy, which is how a ruler or a leader acquires a kind of legitimacy, acquires a kind of acceptance for their assuming the position of rulership or leadership by doing the things that the people want done. So warding off plague, famine, and war, and injustice, which was said earlier. So they possess great wisdom, brilliant and profound. Okay, those are personal credentials. But the rest of this is performative legitimacy. Those are not qualities they possess, but rather those are actions they perform which establish their legitimacy. And this is, so these are the models, the ancestral sovereigns. So now in the next stanza, we talk about the Sakyong and the Sakyong Wangmo, who are the most proximate, the most immediate examples, closer to us than the Rigdons, closer to us than the ancient ancestral sovereigns, the current embodiments of the Shambhala principle of warrior kingship or warrior rulership. The ones who are nobly born as Mukpo clan, who defeat the eclipse of the great eastern sun and sharpen the blade of primordial Ashe, they are victorious over all their enemies, the forces of materialism. They see the tiger lion, Garuda dragon vision. They are fearless in the midst of barbarian arrogance. They tame the untamable beings. They inspire the savages of the setting sun into the sophistication of the great eastern sun. I pay homage to the Sakyong and the Sakyong Wangmo. So I'm going to talk about this a couple of talks down the road, but the underlined portion here, Mukpo clan, is a notion that in the history of politics has come up as, in the Germanic tribes, it's called kinright. So there's a notion that Mukpo clan membership is a prerequisite for ruling. Now, Mukpo clan membership, I could be understood in different ways. One way is that those are the practitioners of the teachings of the Mukpo family, that is Trungpa Rinpoche's family lineage, dating back to Gesar at least. So that notion that one among the Mukpos could rule, in a dualistic sense, is all among the Mukpos rule. And that means all those who are warriors, who are practicing this type of gentle warriorship, are rule. Now, of course, there's a hint of family or kinright here that is potentially literal, and it's not my position to really sort that out at this time. The rest of this is personal worth. So birth is an aspect of personal worth, but it could also be a legal claim in a hereditary system. And then the rest of this these are deeds, defeating the eclipse of the great eastern sun. It doesn't really matter what they mean. It's just that the way they're phrased, they're clearly accomplishments or qualities. So they defeat the eclipse of the great eastern sun, sharpen the blade of primordial Ashe, victorious over all their enemies, and so on and so forth. These are related to war. It's notable. So we have like a very classical view of warriorship here. But at the same time, when we get to the end, what the Mukpo clan rulers, the Sakyong and Sakyong Wangmo, actually do, they inspire the savages of the setting sun into the sophistication of the great eastern sun. That is to say, they don't dominate, but they promote, they propagate power, and they inspire the enemy. Finally, radiating confidence, peaceful, illuminating the way of discipline, eternal ruler of the three worlds, may the great eastern sun be victorious. And so this is that notion of basic goodness, or great eastern sun, that radiates or shines when we practice gentleness. So radiating confidence, peaceful, is you could say a synonym for gentleness, is the practice of non-aggression or gentleness that allows power, that allows goodness to radiate. And not an individual goodness, but the great eastern sun, which is our sort of source quality, our connection to the source, becomes evident. So in talk 3, I'm going to deal with two seminal works of literature, Beowulf and Macbeth. One shows a restrained hero and the other shows an unrestrained hero. Thank you very much.